I don't feel like the school system's serving my child well, but I know what to do about it. I'm gonna go talk to the principal, I'm gonna come and testify, I'm gonna do all that. Versus, I don't think the school system's serving my child well, and I have no clue where to start, or that anybody cares what I have to say. Right.
Just one language note, and I don't know what the issue is, but I always like to use the word families rather than parents, and I don't know what the number of kids are who may be living with aunt, uncle, grandma, whatever it may be, but I always like to use the word families to be more inclusive, so that the person who may not be the parent doesn't feel like we're not speaking to them. When you use families, it's just more of an umbrella. And then I actually don't know what our number is in terms of kids who are being raised by someone other than a parent. I just as a language issue, as we think about who, because it also goes to that issue of how we think of who we serve, and if we're thinking, I'm always struck by the national numbers. 51% of kids live in a single parent family, and of kids who live in dual parent families, 83% of those families have working parents. Both parents work. So when we think about who's serving our kids, it goes beyond the parent, and I think language matters in that case. So if we can just think about families, I think that it may broaden our understanding and also help communicate what we're trying to do in terms of some of our people.
So following up on Chris's encouragement to say, so I would add the economically advantaged versus the economically dissident, and then I would say the well-informed versus the less well-informed as stakeholders. And I don't know. Well, I mean, again, there's a hierarchy of trying to, to make some sense out of this. But my sense is what we're trying to do is create a flavor of stakeholders, and then, again, depending on what prism you're looking through. So,
We also have faith-based partners.
Faith-based, then there are community groups, whether it's a neighborhood association, whether it's whatever, it's just various community groups. I just put community groups. What's that? Yeah.
They're all sort of in the nonprofit community, but sort of at a different
It's
level.
a different. When I was thinking nonprofit, more of like a social service, someone trying to do something different than civic association, is more of a community group. That's my way to think about it. But
there's another group here that.
Oh yeah.
Well, that's part of the group.
There are commonwealth community, there are government agency collaborators. I don't know what else to call them. Folks who work with all
I appreciate listing all this out. I also am a firm believer that since the Montgomery County Public Schools is the signature element of the Montgomery County brand, everybody's our stakeholder. And I understand we got to list it out because you got to talk strategy and all that. And some are more, important than others in terms of how frequency and communication and all that. But at the same time, there's nobody in this community that isn't a stakeholder in some way, shape, or form because the schools are so important to this community.
So, I think it's a really good point. I think one of the challenges that with communications and public engagement is there's only so much time in the day, only so much time in the week. And so to Phil's earlier point about two-way communication, to Chris's point around messaging and purpose, it's just a multitude of different stakeholders. And I know that throughout the day as we deconstruct this, the point is to put it back together with prioritization that we then attach action to. And whether or not, Chris, we can get to message definitions or not, we know that those are next steps down the road to a really tight communications and engagement plan. I mean, one thing that really struck me in reading just a variety of other school districts over the last 6 is, and I have to commend our board for, there's no real strategic approach to communications that boards are taking, and there may be some joint efforts, and that's things that we also need to attend to. But I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that it's hard to get to a strategic place without going through a process of prioritization, resource allocation, time investment, and so, for what that's worth. I mean, there's something to say about.
Yeah, I just wanted to break the students down as well. The non-SGA students and the SGA. We see the SGA, the student government students all the time, but it's the others that we're not being able to engage with as much.
But also, as a stakeholder, we've got parents, but I guess we have specifically the PTA. I mean, that's, PTA is a principal stakeholder.
So, I know it's, as I told you at the beginning, there's a lot of them, and I agree, I think you have more stakeholders than we'll ever list. But in going through this, what I wanted you to think through, and what I wanted to just kind of hone in on, if we're talking about an engagement communication strategy, there are groups, it already sounded like there are groups, even when we got to those families who know how to engage with the school systems. If you change it from a board meeting to, it's a picnic once a week, they're going to continue to know, and they're going to be ones that are going to reach out and engage. So what we're trying to get to is, what are the groups that you need to kind of figure out what are the better methodology for engagement and or communication, and are we getting to groups where, even if we do group them together, because it sounded like when we were talking about this group of special education youth and talented English as a second language, it sounds like they may have different questions, concerns, challenges, maybe even with the disciplinary problem. It's not somebody, that is a family that knows how to engage, but they want to engage differently, or they need to be able to get information differently. I just want to make sure that we look at it, and you all are much more familiar with this, what are those groupings? Because when we go, and we don't necessarily have to group them, because when we go to the next step and we actually have you all say prioritize, and again, this is not who is the most important to communicate with, but who do we need to focus on, that if we came up with an engagement methodology by the end of the day, that you would be able to scratch that itch. You would be able to figure out how you're engaging with them, what the objectives are of that engagement, what type of messaging would you eventually add in there. And be able to cover multiple of these, because the reality is, some of it through social media, you'll be able to disseminate information or communicate, but in other cases you won't, and you're not going to be able to go door to door. So what is that medium ground, and how can we, in today's session, get to hitting on a couple of those that would be broad reaching? So we think that we've got enough of the stakeholders listed up there, or at least enough groupings and or granularity, we can probably take a little break and then move on. But hold on, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure, please.
I just want to add something. As we work through this, I think we need to be cautious, though. A lot of times we'll say the African American community or the Latino community, and it's not monolithic. There are differences within all of these communities. So I just offer that as something that we keep in mind.
So you know what I'm saying, because I think they fall into these other categories.
Yeah.
So I don't know if this is stakeholder or the stakeholder list is a strategy list, but there are what I call key communicators that cut across multiple groups that require a different level of attention. Because I know if I'm talking to one of them, they're going to get a message out to another 10, 20, 30, 40
So we
people.
have Vegas.
Yeah, that's right. Or I know that there are certain go-to people in the community that if I tell them what's going on, other people go to them because they say, hey, what's really going on with such and such and so-and-so. And so again, I don't know if it's a strategy, it's probably both. It's a strategy, it's also a stakeholder issue. The people who are those kind of key communicators, those go-to people who are trustworthy, are seen as credible, and are the source of information about what oftentimes it's very informal, and they exist in all different parts of the community. So again, I don't know if that's a stakeholder issue, or if that's just something you want to think about from the strategy, but it's an important group.
Sounds like an approach review and leverage, and it does sound like it's
Right.
a stakeholder, because there may be a way that you want to engage with them more,
Right.
more formally, not necessarily formally.
Right. I mean, just for example, at my previous, we had a list, we had an email list, and there were people like that got, I knew that by reaching out to them, certain ways, that message would carry. So we just have this.
So I guess when you're thinking about that, the key thing to think about is, obviously, this is someone that's a trusted communicator,
Right.
because they're not gonna play telephone, and by the time the last person gets in that, it's completely garbled. Anyone else?
So I don't know how to categorize this, but there is a community at the center of many of these communities that is disenfranchised, disengaged, suffering from poverty, may have language issues, may have immigration issues. Those are communities that we have the toughest time reaching. But they are a cross-section of many of the stakeholders that we got up there.
Yes.
Substandard housing, high crime.
Yeah, so I wouldn't necessarily, based on what you just described, that I'm not necessarily gonna list all those other things, because to the,
Right.
to the points earlier from him, I think if you came up, so it sounded like we heard there were those that know how to engage, and those that don't know how to engage, but then there's those that, maybe they do know how to engage, but they don't care anymore. You're saying they're just either disconnected, or they kind of fall into a different bucket of.
To Laura's point, you'll find pieces of all of these in every single.
I know you said staff, but I really do think our principals are, in every area, they are community figurehead, separate from MCPS. I know our principals, I know several of our high school principals, this will be like a community pool. And people go up to them like they're God, and like, oh my gosh, you're the principal, I just,
We got to break down the whole employee group. So two other, higher ed, is a really important stakeholder. I also, and you guys might disagree, but I think the haters are stakeholders. The haters, the people who
I
just.
don't see caterers in one.
The people who just are whatever we do, they're just hating on us. For whatever reason. But they are stakeholders. And then the other group, and this is a little different, and I probably have a different perspective on this than others, but people around the country pay a lot of attention to us and benchmark what they're doing. I just, was in this large county consortium meeting yesterday, the number of people with other superintendents, like, they benchmark what they're doing against us, right? And they're not a stakeholder in the sense that of the people we're trying to serve here, but they are people that look closely at what we're doing and use it in different kinds of ways, in ways that we may not even know. And it's, again, it's not a stakeholder that we're trying to serve, but also know that what we do actually spreads around the country in some ways that we're not even aware of. So I don't know if that fits, but.
I mean, it's good from an awareness perspective, knowing that they're looking in, and I'll put it, I don't know what to call them, but external to community.
Yeah.
Looking in.
So, I have a question about the last one, so I don't know what this is. Because there's this piece about all the other stakeholders, or most of the other stakeholders that we listed, we have some level of intention with them? And with the external ones, do we have a level of intention with them?
Yeah,
And so it becomes more their reaction to what we're doing, you know what I mean? As opposed to, we want to shift something in our relationship with the other folks. We're trying to better the relationship or the leverage the relationship or whatever it is. And I'm not saying that we don't need to pay attention to it, but I think it's very different because to me, with the external onlookers, it's brand management more than it is, you know.
It is. For completeness, it's worth putting up there because when you guys have knocked all the rest of them out of the park and you're getting to the point where maybe there is a deliberate communication, you may want to have that deliberate communication. I mean, to the point, to Phil's point, you may want to be selling yourself and have more deliberate communication. We're not going to get there today. I mean, I think Josh was bringing it up as another potential stakeholder. I think when you guys go through, we're going to see that other groups are going to fall out.
Well, and I guess the only thing I would, one of the reasons why it's important is because as people look at, you know, our commitment to equity, they look at things where they actually use us to leverage change in other places. And again, it's not a stakeholder in the way that our families and kids are stakeholders, our employees, our taxpayers, but in the sense that there's a broader group of folks that looks at us and we model for, whether intentionally or unintentionally, but you know, it's there. I wouldn't put it again in that group of people we're trying to serve, but just to know that may, I don't know what that means for us necessarily, but it just, you know,
Anyone else? Okay. You guys are doing absolutely phenomenal on time, which is, I know you all want to go home early today. Basically what we're going to do is we're going to take a break, because I was supposed to give you a break somewhere around now anyway. We're going to take a 15-minute break. While you're on break, what I'd like for you to do is, I'm going to put this one up there, I'd like you to, I know you know, take your stickies and you get 3 each on your arm. 3 each. You're going to pick the 3 that you want to focus on. It's not that there are top stakeholders, but it's, think about, let's get the priority. Oh, we didn't, oh, no, I'm sorry, no, we're not going to prioritize.
Okay.
Forget that. I'm jumping ahead of myself. We're not going to prioritize. We're just going to take a 15-minute break.
Okay.
So go ahead and take a 15-minute break. Because from there, similar to when we were talking about stakeholders, and there were kind of groups of stakeholders that weaved in between multiple other stakeholders, they're going to have needs and expectations that are common. And that's what we're trying to get to, is what are some of those common, I'll call them values, and that way we can hone in on that, and if we start to create a structure around that, that'll allow you to hit multiple stakeholders with one set of communication plans. So that's where we're driving to. So right now, I know I threw you for a loop, we're not doing any dots. We're going to talk
was a
about...
fingertip hit right now,
So we're going to talk about the stakeholder values, needs, and expectations. So again, this is a brainstorming activity. You guys have been really great on the brainstorming. There are no bad ideas. Throw them out there, because as we go through, things will fall away if they get combined with other ideas. But we would just want to get all the ideas up there. So keeping in mind, putting yourself in these stakeholders' shoes, we want you to think about what is important to them. We want to talk about what do they need from you. What is it, information? Is it actual things that they need from you? Because again, if we're talking about engagement, there may be other things just than data. What are their expectations and what do they want to know about? So we talked again, those various stakeholders, those are just kind of thoughts and ideas that we're thinking about if they are individuals who either know how to get information from you or don't know how to get information from you or know how to engage or don't know. What is it that they need? What is it that they are, you wouldn't want to communicate with them or engage with them if they didn't need to be able to communicate with you. So what is it we're trying to drive at what those items are? So again, thinking of this broad set of stakeholders, no idea is a bad idea. What are they looking for from you?
For families is what is happening for 2 or for their
their students, the impact of their students.
Are we taking these in order or?
No, it's just, it's all of them. It's, because it's, at the end of the day, your stakeholders could have common needs and values.
I would go to what Mr. Kaufman said earlier about the two-way piece, so they need the opportunity to share their ideas, their input, and know that the stakeholder, their voices will be heard, and that it's informing decision-making, policy-making, and so forth. And I think there's an expectation of that as well.
There's a set of families and parents, community stakeholders, who ask the question, how is school relevant to the adults?
I think that's a big question that our kids ask too, especially kids who are disengaged.
I think families want access to information. Often, when I'm attending an event or celebration around some type of partnership, parents will say, well, I wish I'd known about this sooner. And you know, so I'm always mindful of how we can really strengthen that aspect of our work, making sure that more families, all families have access to this information.
I think they want to be seen as real partners in the work, and the reality is we cannot do this work alone. So I think they want to feel like not just in word alone, but that we really do feel like they are important partners with us.
I think there's a couple different things. One is, how do I help my kid? Another is return on investment.
Is it how do I help my kid, or is how do I help my student? Or is there any difference?
My child. Right. Or yeah, I mean, I guess I was thinking about families. It's how do I help my child?
So it's not restricted just to those that are in the school? Because we talked about that there are students
Right.
that aren't, or children that aren't in school yet.
I think return on investment is another thing. And then I also think that people want to know how we're future casting. Right? And it's not just about new standards, but it's also about, new ideas and programs, new technologies, whatever it is. Some people out there pay a lot of attention to what's going on in the education space. They want to say, how are we doing this? And there's this sort of, sometimes people have a overly simplistic view of what's possible. They get frustrated when we're not able to do what they think might be a common sense solution. Or we might sometimes resist it, right? And so how do we help them understand how we're doing new things and trying to innovate and meet new challenges, while also not just adopting the flavor of the month?
I think for many of our stakeholders, it's not so much, I think their focus is more on their individual school and how their individual school is, meeting their kids' needs. I don't know that the average, care about our budget or care about our vision or care about our core values, and maybe that's important to us, but my guess is that they're really focused on what's happening in my local school and is my local school being responsive. They may care about system things. I mean, I want to know about other programs. I wish I knew that, there is this program or just informational things, but I'm not sure that, I don't know that there is focus as much on system kinds of messaging and using all that.
Well, and I think, with respect to families and students, they both want to know sort of what are the expectations and how will I know whether my child is, meeting those expectations, right? We get a lot of questions about that. But I also think at a system level, want to know, so what is our collective, the we, board, superintendent, staff, what is our expectations for our school system? Like, what do we expect a high school to offer, a middle school to offer, an elementary school to offer? What do we expect schools to look like, and what are we doing about it?
And how we hold them accountable.
And how we're holding them accountable.
There's some frustrations, my school doesn't offer this. I understand that school, a half a mile away offers something different. Why isn't just a lack of understanding about how schools deliver services and just a sense of frustration that they think that maybe another school close by is doing things differently and better.
Josh already talked about return on investment, but I think some of the conversation about whether we're spending the dollars we have well is, just also sort of an expectation that, we're making decisions based on solid research. We have really good reason why we're doing the things we're doing, or the structured the way we're structured, or, we are organized in a way to best serve the needs of our students.
So this is repetitive statement, but so one of the questions that I'm constantly hearing is how are we serving the public well with others, right? Is the question. And I don't know if it's the same comment. Are we integrated tightly enough with county government and the nonprofit sector in serving the public?
Because there are lots of other entities that focus on youth. And so we've got students between 9 and 3, and how do we work with the other agencies, entities, individuals, nonprofits that serve?
And because we have students, the assumption is that we have access to families that should be leveraging that access.
Right.
So I think, and this would go into the student, family, and employee groups. I think people want to know that we care about them as individuals. And coupled with that is that we have to be attentive to the system when we care about individual kids, families, and employees, and that we're thinking about them while we're also, again, having a balance in the entire system. We want to know that we value everybody equally, or appropriately, whatever the right word is, as people, as stakeholders, while we're making decisions as a system, right? We want to feel that.
I also think, in the context of communication and engagement, I think there's a high expectation that we may not always make decisions that people agree with, but I think they want to see and understand how have we processed, considered, given careful thought to their input. Because, if I ask you to come talk to me or come to a meeting or give testimony, how did that factor in, matter, influence my thinking, even if I do end up at the point you would like me to know?
People expect, rightfully so, transparency. And that's integrity of decision making, that's consistency, and that's, making the data public, whatever it is, but people, rightfully so, expect it to be transparent. And they expect, again, rightfully so, integrity, which for me means I did what I said I was going to do, right? And here's the data I used to make the decision prior to people to ensure this, that we expect a level of integrity in how we do business.
So, any other stakeholders, thinking about any other stakeholders, some of the ones that maybe are either disenfranchised or those that maybe have some unable to be reached, do we know what their needs, are they the same needs and values potentially? Are there other, talk a little bit about the students, talk a lot about their families.
I guess there's a need to ask them what they value rather than just assuming we know.
From a validation perspective, I think there's things you already know, there probably are some others, and maybe that's, when we get to talking about the types of engagement, that might be, when we're talking about two-way communication.
But I do think there's some problems when we're translating sometimes because we think we get it, or we think we understand and know. So I do think that piece is important.
We have to be conscious of how we communicate, because sometimes we talk in education needs, and maybe the average person out there doesn't understand a lot of the jargon.
Any other expectations or values or needs from the stakeholders?
Maybe it's there to just be treated with respect.
It probably goes into every issue, but I think people expect consistency from us. And that means, you know, so there's consistent treatment.
So I'm not totally sure what you mean, but I also think people do expect that we will be open to new ideas and new ways of doing things.
No, when I meant consistency, that I'm not gonna treat one person one way and another person another way. And I'm not gonna, you know, there's sort of equal
That's why I put it
opportunity.
under the treat with
Yeah, it's
respect, because
different
it
than
is,
You know, that there's no, you know, and I don't wanna say that everyone's equal value, because in fact, we need to work more with others, but we gotta explain so that there's a level of consistency in how we approach the work,
I
right?
would kind of disagree with you on in that I think that is what we should expect ourselves, but I think people in general don't expect that. I think people do think that they should be getting special treatment at this or that. I think everybody wants to be, face that their case is different and unique and,
So then I guess
only
that's
say
what
this is a line.
But it is both, because there is a way
Mix
that
of both, yeah.
you have a lot of folks who feel like, well, wait a minute, you can look at examples of discipline issues and say, well, wait a minute, this kid didn't get X, you know, but we had the same situation, and then there is then the other side is parents who feel like they have this privilege, and we're supposed to jump and chop at whatever they want.
So, yeah, and just to be clear, consistency does not mean you don't differentiate according to need. It's just that you don't treat
it's
them.
not biased.
Yeah, I just may not be explaining myself well.
No, I think we got it. I just think that there's a way that there's both of them.
Right.
And that's the issue, is that on the one hand, there's this expectation that there is going to be consistency, and there are a lot of folks who historically have not seen that consistency and expect it. And they look for us to be the place where they can get it and their kids are going to get it, because they want their kids to grow up in a place where they're not going to have to see the same things that they as parents have seen. And then there's the other folks who exercise their privilege on a minute-by-minute basis and expect that because they have resources or they have connections or whatever it is, that those same privileges are supposed to be exercised in the schoolhouse or when decisions have to be made and on and on. You know, and it's like we're challenged with both sides of that. You know, so I think folks agree. It's just, it comes in different ways.
I would also say that people need and expect us to be honest, truthful about the work. And part of it for me is, the work is so complex and there's no easy answers, and the greater the level of truth and honesty about the work at hand, the better you're actually able to engage with people about solutions. But we need to just be, warts and all, be able to talk about stuff that we're trying to do.
I think there also has to be a recognition, because that input is not always agreement. We listen, we consider, but we may not be able to do whatever it is that you said, because, we hear from people, I wrote you, I told you, you didn't do this.
So that's, I think that's back to the expectation that they can see or understand that you took into account.
Right.
May not have agreed, but took into account the input. They took the time to give input in whatever methodology, facts or social media, they took it into account. Yes.
And I do think that there's an expectation. I think we share it. We talk about sort of continuous improvement, but I think there is an expectation that we're going to continue to grow and be open to new ideas. I mean, they wouldn't expect the classroom to look the same, in 1950, 1970, 1990, 2015. That we're open to changing with the times, and not just saying that's how we did it and that's how we're going to continue to do it.
This is a hard one, but I think people expect to be led. They don't expect us to sit back. I know that's in a sense what you were saying when you said future casting, but I think we have a responsibility to lead and to say this is the direction we're going and this is the why of it. And I think people expect that. And, yeah.
So we hit on kind of what we think is important. So think again about all the stakeholders, things that are important to them, the reasons that we want to engage with them. We kind of covered.
And this is a slight digression, and I can send it to everybody, but I'm going to send all of you Simon Sinek's TED Talk on the why, the what, and how. It's a 17-minute talk about 85% of organizations, 85% of communications about what and how, and the organizations that are most successful communicate and talk about the why. And it's a very, very compelling 17-minute TED Talk. The best line, and my favorite one is, Martin Luther King said, I have a dream, now I have a plan, right? Whereas organizations are always talking about the plans, but not the dream. And I'll send it to you guys. It's a very important one that the more you focus on why we're doing what we're doing, the more people follow, get involved, and get engaged. And we're always just talking about what, and how, and they're not as engaged with it.
So is it fair to say that you think all the stakeholders want to know why?
Yeah, that's right. It goes into the leadership.
I was just saying that's the
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Why are we doing it? Just not why, why do we do it? Goes back to the values, or why do we do what we do?
Anything else? Thinking about, again, all those different stakeholders, what's important to them, what are the things that they need to know about, care about, concerned about, expect.
I thought the taxpayers want to know that we're not wasting resources.
Was that to the return on investment, spending dollars well, best serving, a little bit?
This, I'm not exactly sure where this fits in, because I don't know that people would articulate this as something they need. But I think that stakeholders, and this goes into the why piece, so there's an individual level, particularly for board members, but also for superintendents, senior staff. What are our stories? right? Why do we do what we do? Right? But what is it that drives us to do the work that we're doing as electeds and as leaders of the system? And there's again, I don't think people expect that of us, but it is when they need, part of it they need to understand who we are and why we do what we do and what drives us to do it. The more that you actually spend time engaging with people in personal narrative and stories, the more people come together and build community, because there's so much shared interest that folks have, but we don't spend enough time, engaged in that kind of communication with folks.
Well, that may fit a little bit into the transparency piece and the integrity piece. It's like people don't just necessarily believe you have integrity, they know you have integrity because of your actions. And so if through understanding a little bit more of where you're coming from and knowing who you are, plays into a little bit of that.
And who you are and what you're all about, right? And why you've chosen to do this with your time.
So looking at the list of stakeholders, making sure we're trying to cover as many as we can, come up with a lot of different, what we're calling values, because they're kind of values, expectations. Got some mixes in here of stuff that, maybe is a little bit more of the information they may need or the types of things they may need. But I want to make sure everybody kind of understands where we're headed with this is, we are going to do stuff. Taking a look at, again, there's probably some common things in here. We talked a little bit about transparency. We talked about, from a stakeholder perspective, what is the impact on their students? Looking at how do they share their input, and that kind of tied into a little bit of knowing that they're giving input, that they know where it's going. So those may be kind of similar, but it's okay. You're going to have some commonalities across them. But what I'm going to ask you to do is, again, thinking about these stakeholders, looking at across these different values, and you are going to take, so just going to kind of narrow in on a couple things. Take your dots, and I want you to pick the 3 that you think are the most cross-cutting and/or we're not skipping much, we're going to come back to it. Think about what is the most important to these stakeholders. And again, knowing that we talked a little bit earlier about reaching out to maybe some of the ones that are harder to reach. What of these do you think need to be addressed first? These are just things to think in mind when you're going through with your dots. And then what are the most broad reaching? So again, some of these are common, so there were some overlap on some of these, so it doesn't matter if you go for one or the other, they end up being a little bit combined. But I want you as individuals to think about your stakeholders and think about what you're trying to accomplish here. So you're going to take your dots and you're going to get 3 of them. And I want you to pick the 3 that you think are the ones that we should focus on based on what's important to the stakeholders. Okay. So I'm going to give you a test. You're going to stand up, and I think we need this one. So we have this. I added on there the how is their input used, because I think they're interrelated. I don't think you can do one, you can't do one without the other. So if they're gonna be able to give their input, in a very, in a way that is meaningful, they're gonna wanna know how are you using that input, because otherwise they're gonna stop giving input. Yes?
I know this is on my mind all along, but I think we do a lot of outreach, but it's so structured that we may not be able to get some of those outreach that people want. So I thought that would probably be the opportunity.
So to make it less structured, or to?
Yeah, but sometimes we need to make things less structured so that we can hear.
Correct. So when we go in, so what we're going to do, someone's going to get assigned this, we're going to talk about what are the best forums to be able to do this. Because when we were, it was funny because there was a question about, I'm not really sure kind of what you're asking me here. And part of what we're trying to get to is, based on that, if we think that that's really one of the most important things, you guys, we talked about at the beginning, you already have mechanisms in place. What do you want to call them? Modalities, mechanisms, tools. There are things in place that maybe just if you tweaked them, they'd be better. Or maybe it's something you just gotta shake up the whole thing and redo, because they're not getting the opportunity to give their input, or even if they are, they don't see in the end, what does it mean? And so there's probably a couple of different ways to go about doing that, and we're gonna talk about, where each group is gonna have a chance to kind of come up and develop that a little bit further.
So I'm just struck by a couple of things, if I may. So one question I always ask, just as a thought question, are public schools a private commodity or a public good? And I don't know that there is an actual answer to that, but I think it's important to think of it, and particularly as there are those out there who believe they are a private commodity, who push for vouchers and charters, and it's all about, you know, the individual, right? And of course, we are all about the individual, but where is the relationship between the public good and the belief out there, and we've been sometimes, my tax dollars go to the school system, you must, you know, I gotta see there's one-to-one correlation between my tax dollars and the services my child is getting, right? And it's part of what the sort of way we think about public schools in America. And again, I'm not saying one or the other, I mean, I know where I come down on it in terms of being on public good, but how much of what, and as I look at a couple of things up there, which are absolutely essential, particularly how individual schools is meeting my child's needs and being responsive, it's not clear to me how the Board of Education does that. The school does that. How does the Board of Education and the system do that? We can set expectations, we can facilitate, we can support, et cetera, et cetera. What's the board's role in that? And
So
I'm not saying there isn't one.
Oh, I look at that a little differently. I look at that, the reason that was highlighted is when we're talking about what do the stakeholders need to know about, they're trying to figure out how do they get the information on how is that individual school meeting my children's needs and being responsive. Not necessarily we're deciding how you're going to make the schools.
Right, I guess I was thinking about the next one. I maybe should tell you off here, you guys, which is certainly not the first or the last time. They translate that into action for us in terms of how we strategize and all that. It's just not, I'm not making that connection, even though I absolutely understand how important that one is, right? So,
but I think the issue isn't for the board in terms of the actions that are taken, but how we're using communications and engagement to make sure that people know how and to help folks bridge that gap. I think that we do have a responsibility for, because I think when people feel that disconnect, they look to us to figure out, well, how is this, you know, what do you need to be changing? How does this work? Not the actual, are they being met or not being met, but how are we helping parents to get there and know, and we got a level we do hold, while we started holding you accountable, parents hold us accountable when it doesn't happen for those kids, no matter, for their kids, no matter what they think in terms of dividing the board from the administration, they ultimately hold us accountable. And we see this all the time. They'll jump over everything to get to us because they come to us with their appeals. They come to us. So I think that our role in here really actually stays in the communication realm because it allows for us to help parents understand what do you need to do, how do you need to do it, you know, and so I think that you might be looking at it like too much like the boss, you know, because you're looking at the operations. But I think for us, it really does stay in the communications realm. I just think that you know.
Well, I mean, I guess so. The decisions that the education experts make about how we're gonna do the things that we agreed are part of the vision and mission. So, take an example. We're gonna try intervention schools as a strategy. So the professionals are bringing that to us, but we as the board members, right, we're allocating resources to it, and when we go in the community, we gotta be able to talk about what is it, why do we think it's gonna work, how are we gonna know that it's working or not working? I mean, there's got to be that ability to do that. And so, and I think, and when we go out to the community, we go to cluster meetings, people are always talking to us about, what are we doing? What are we doing to meet our students' needs in the future? So we get questions about how are we keeping up on technology? What kind of testing are we doing? Why are we doing the testing we're doing? And again, not saying that the board should decide what happens in schools, but it has to be consistent with the strategic planning framework. The dollars that we invest, we gotta know what we've invested in and why, and then be able to speak to whether it's working.
And so to me, I see these, specifically, except for I can't speak right now, specifically these two will require two totally different types of engagement/communication. Because one of them, we're talking about how am I effectively getting their input and using it and making sure they know that that's happening. The other one is more of a, to your point of the push communication side of it. Is it something that because of we've allocated resources, maybe these that would have to happen in some sort of public forum, or it could come through another methodology to know these are the things that the school is doing, the school community is doing that is helping to meet those needs. So that's what we're trying to get. It's not necessarily forcing the school to do this stuff. How do the parents, how do the stakeholders, how do the families, how do they know what's happening?
I kind of saw that question. First, I just want to drop it. I found this very difficult to do. I think everything that we put up there was important. So I wasn't a fan.
That's what we talked about.
Process. Just want to throw that out there. I'm glad I didn't say it. But the how do I help my child? I saw that in more of like a technical way, to be honest. I saw it in more of like with the new math curriculum, maybe doing things like making sure that the math curriculum stuff is up online so that parents have access to it as well. Making, especially when there aren't textbooks coming home. I saw that in more of those things. Making sure that our schools are sending out robocalls to parents every Sunday night, making it mandatory, saying this is what's happening this week, this is what you need to know for your child, this is what tests are coming up or whatever it might be. So I saw it more as that one as a much less broad thing and more of a specific for some communication things that need to be done in order to support parents specifically.
And so to your, because I'm sure I asked the same question. We know that all of this is important and like you're gonna need to do this with integrity and they're gonna require transparency and there's a lot of stuff that was on there. But to kind of focus us in on a couple of areas that will help you think about the communication framework, the engagement framework that you want to put in place so that when we go through and we talk about, and I'll bring up the board meeting, if you have a board meeting. At the board meeting, are you hitting those? Are you addressing those? And if you are you addressing them in a way that like, do they get to have opportunity for input? Is it too structured? Does that need to change? So this was just to try to help hone in on focusing on a couple of them because we could boil it, because there are lots of tools and we could boil the ocean. So it was not to say that those other things are not important, but for today, so we could get down to a couple of them, just to give you the nod on why we're doing this methodology. But that's exactly the point, is to look at not necessarily how does the school do it, but how do you communicate and let them know what's happening. Anything else on those two? Okay, so then obviously how do I help my child was another one. And I did highlight the return on investment piece because I think the piece on return on investment, even though we may not be able to get to, I think that's going to be weaved through all of the things that you're going to look at. Because they're going to look at if you're going to put math curriculum online, is that something that is the most valuable to them and how does that help them? So those are the four you all kind of rallied around. Obviously, there are a couple of others that I do think, obviously they're all important. All right. So I get it. So from a process check perspective, what we did was we talked about, kind of what's happening, what's working today, what are the forms. And we heard about some of the challenges that maybe a little too structured, maybe some of the methodologies are a little antiquated. But then, of course, you introduce social media, and that can also be overwhelming. And it may not reach all of the stakeholders, because they may not have the ability to get to items online like that. So then we talked about who are those stakeholders, and what is, who are they, how broad reaching are they? And then we wanted to talk about, and had to brainstorm around what were the things that they really rallied around, what did they need to be able to understand and focus on from a value expectation perspective. So what we're gonna move into next, but we're probably gonna take another, we may not take a break yet. What we want to move into next is, I called it strategic actions because I was really trying to think about, from your perspective, what are the, because I struggled with the whole communication engagement concept, because there are tools, technologies, capabilities, frameworks, and some of them are very, very specific to you all and the way you do your business. So what we wanted to talk about and wanted to step into were what are these strategic actions and opportunities, and kind of how can you address what we just talked about here. So what are those things that could be done that would help address these values from the stakeholder perspective, would help them understand or see or gain information on those activities. So, let's see, we're wading through this.
No, it's good, we'll have more time.
Yeah. So, if they are, things to think about when we talk about a strategic action or opportunity. Because, again, you can think of it as, a town meeting, a board meeting, an online forum, I try to say right meeting, not because I'm completely overwhelming, but, or it is some sort of going out in the local community. I know there were some activities you guys already have where they go into different areas and do things. So, things that already exist.
Let's just knock on doors.
Knock on doors. Or you can
that.
use your lingers. You can use your Kevin Bacons in the world to help you do that. So, it's like, what are the ways to communicate with them? Is it in person? Is it online? Should it be done through mailings if they don't have email? Is that, do they still need to get, something in the mail? How do you reach these different stakeholders to address what they're looking for? If it's something, if you're putting a math curriculum online, maybe that's, you can let them know about it, and maybe, maybe they have a way that they can get to it. Maybe you go to a local library, and I'm just totally making stuff up. But, that I want you to think broadly around that, because obviously, there's going to be challenges. There's going to be challenges to, if we talk about going door to door, how do you get all the people to do that? Do you have the staff to support it? Do you have the skills to support it? It sounds like at the beginning, which was great, you do actually have some staff and you do actually have some dollars as far as resources go to be able to apply to this and to be able to focus on that. But there may be other challenges. So what I wanted you to think about, and we're actually going to do these in your groups, at your tables, and then we'll have brief, is I want you to kind of brainstorm on thinking about these activities, these values that we talked about. What are ways that you could communicate these or engage with the community to share that information?
Could I ask,
Yeah.
make an administrative request?
Yeah.
Could we get those 3 top ones typed up and so we can physically have them on our desk?
We can,
Because that would just be helpful to be able to see
as long
it.
as someone here can print.
Print,
Okay.
more obvious.
So then why don't we go ahead, let's go ahead and take a break. We'll get those typed up and printed out.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I just need like 2 minutes to type it up, and then project it up.
Some way that we can, because I can't read that.
I was waiting for somebody to come with that very, very excellent handwriting.
Oh, no, it's not the quality, it's not the quality of the print.
It's
It's just the age of the eyes.
Okay. There's, the worst part about being the scribe is you forget how to spell, and your handwriting becomes worse. I've learned that over the years, so.
So we want to take a 3-minute break. We're going to